Mr. Chairman, one of the most important responsibilities we have as a Congress, I think, is to protect and advocate for those who may not have the power themselves or the influence or the armies of lawyers to contend with red tape that all too often is created by our own government. The bill we're considering today helps them. It does just that. It relieves, and we believe, an unnecessary regulatory burden on really small internet service providers, the little ISPs out there all over our districts and across the land that are struggling to compete in this marketplace. By extending an exemption to the Federal Communications Commission's enhanced transparency rules, this bill allows these small businesses to focus on their core mission, which, by the way, is providing broadband internet access to customers all across America. Now, over the last few months, we spent a great deal of time focused on this issue. We first raised concerns with the Federal Communications Commission itself in a November letter from the Republican members of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, as well as the Small Business Committee. We urged the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, to not only make the exemption that they'd already had in their rules permanent, but also to raise that threshold for defining what a small business is, to bring it in line with the definitions previously blessed by the Small Business Administration itself. Well, the FCC instead extended the exemption for just 1 year. That's hardly time enough from these very onerous reporting requirements to make a difference. It's a 1-year extension. And despite the overwhelming support in the record for a permanent extension, it was clear that Congress needed to act, because the FCC wouldn't. So I introduced a discussion draft to get the conversation going that would permanently extend the exception and would increase the threshold by defining a small business to match the definition used by the Small Business Administration itself. Well, we had a hearing in January on this draft. We heard from a small business, an internet service provider from a small community who shared the dilemma that I think was indicative of what other small ISPs face in these circumstances. Should they put up new equipment and expand and improve their service, or if they have to comply with all this reporting requirements called for by the FCC, they said, look, I'm going to have to spend the money instead on hiring lawyers and other compliance officers to meet a reporting requirement that's new. Should they improve service for customers, or should they devote those financial resources to sifting through regulatory language and drafting expensive and extensive reports on esoteric metrics like packet loss? Now, often these small internet service providers provide service to areas of the country that are rural, very rural, remote, or may not be as easy to serve or provide competitive options to customers, to consumers of larger ISPs. We should be making all efforts to promote the viability of these upstarts, these businesses, these small entrepreneurs that are trying to fill the gaps, serve and compete in this very competitive marketplace. We should not be saddling them with additional requirements designed to them out, basically, and it would make it more difficult for them to do the business that they want to participate in. While there were some initial disagreements about how to ease some of these regulatory burdens, Mr. Chairman, Representative Loebsack and I were able to come to a compromise through some very serious negotiations. Worked out well. It's a legislative process. We both agreed there's a problem. We said, okay, I don't really like this number. What about that number? We said we kept a focus on the mission and on the goal, which was to prevent this overreach of the federal government in the regulatory realm. So in our amended bill, we extend the exemption from this reporting requirement to 5 years. Seems like a reasonable number. This gives greater regulatory certainty to these very small internet service providers looking for stability and predictability when they're making some, frankly, pretty expensive investment decisions on equipment and access and expansion. In addition, we increased the threshold for what's defining a small business from what the FCC had, and required the Federal Communications Commission to report back to Congress on this exception, along with data about how small ISPs that is currently lacking. So they don't have all the data we think they need. So as their overseer, we're telling the FCC, go look at this, tell us what it means, come back to us. And we put a sunset on this as well. So Congress will have the opportunity in a couple of years to come back and say, this makes sense. Does it still make sense? Is it in the best interest of consumers and innovation and development of technology in the marketplace? In the end, I think this legislation represents a really solid, thoughtful compromise that will relieve the burdens for our smallest internet service providers while leaving in place really important protections for consumers, Mr. Chairman. See, this does not wipe out what they have to do to serve customers, the laws they have to follow, all that stays. We just said you don't have to do this really burdensome, costly technical reporting to the government. It's important to note that this bill does not affect the bright line rules for managing traffic or the transparency rules adopted in the FCC's 2010 rules. Customers will continue to have access to those disclosures they have come to expect with the information needed to make informed decisions about their internet service. So I'd like to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Eshoo, as well as certainly Mr. Loebsack, for working well with us on this bill. And I'd like to particularly thank Kelsey Geiselman from the Majority Committee staff and Ashley Schlingsberg from Representative Loebsack's staff, I hope I said that right, for their hard work in getting together and working this out. This bipartisan process has resulted in a strong piece of legislation that I'm confident will actually protect many and promote continued network investment and build out by small business so we have a more vibrant, competitive marketplace and more service into areas that otherwise might never get access to high-speed broadband, which, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is really important in places like Tennessee and Oregon and Iowa. This legislation represents a common-sense approach to a problem that directly impacts so many of our constituents. And this solution will enable our country to continue its leadership in broadband deployment. So I would urge my colleagues to join us in this bipartisan legislation. I thank you for allowing us to bring this bill to the House, and I reserve the balance of my time, Mr.